The Civil Rights Act of 1957 was a step in the right direction. While Brown versus Board of Education had made the right call, Congress needed to step up and enforce this through legislation. There were elements in Congress who wanted nothing to do with it, and to this day, the record for the longest filibuster in history goes to South Carolina Senator Strom Thurmond, who talked for just over 24 hours straight to try to keep the Civil Rights Act from being voted on. The bill passed through, and its goal was ensuring that all Americans could exercise their right to vote. You see, just because laws and constitutional amendments existed at the federal level guaranteeing the right to vote, that doesn't mean they weren't effectively blocked at the state level by discriminatory voter registration laws. These laws are designed to introduce roadblocks to people voting because, let's face it, we are a nation of lazy idiots who are only going to do something like our civic duty if we can easily fit it in between episodes of the Kardashians or on our way to or from work. So those who don't want you voting know that they only have to make it a little bit inconvenient, and they'll block a great big chunk of the population from even showing up. The southern states were the first to get in on this, passing new state constitutions and laws after the Civil War and the Restoration Amendments, which put things in place like poll taxes, literacy tests, and grandfather clauses. The 15th Amendment clearly states that the right to vote shall not be denied or abridged, but it wasn't until 1915 that the U.S. Supreme Court struck down Oklahoma's grandfather clause, calling it, quote, repugnant to the prohibitions of the 15th Amendment, unquote. However, while grandfather clauses were killed, this didn't stop the southern states from enacting new laws to sidestep the federal laws. It's a testament to human beings' creativity that they will go to any lengths they feel necessary to come up with new and exciting ways to trample the rights of others when they feel justified in doing so. And as I said before, it's also a statement of how afraid these lawmakers and politicians were of the voting population, that they went to all this trouble in the first place. If it was so easy to just rig an election, none of these voter registration laws would ever have been passed. Of course, it wasn't just blacks who were excluded. Other minority groups have also been discriminated against from the very beginning of our country, such as Native Americans, Asians, Hispanics, and other language minorities. So the Civil Rights Act of 1957 tried to counter this state-level corruption of the voting process. It set up a federal civil rights commission to gather information and make a final report to the president and Congress about voting inequities and discrimination. It also set prohibitions against intimidating, coercing, or otherwise interfering with federal elections. However, this had been heavily watered down in order to get the bill passed at all, so it was difficult to enforce its provisions. White supremacists still felt empowered to burn African American churches and voter registration centers and physically attack black activists, including women and children. It was during this time that Martin Luther King Jr. started becoming active and the civil rights movement really gained momentum. Nonviolent demonstrations and protests attracted the notice of the entire country. In the summer of 1963, voter education and voter registration drives were being assisted and worked on by civil rights movement members in Mississippi. The following year, the summer of 1964, was known as Freedom Summer, with a volunteer effort made to register as many black voters as possible in Mississippi, which at that point was still excluding blacks from voting almost entirely. Hundreds of whites and students from the North went there to participate, and the violence the entire effort was met with was out of control. 80 of these Freedom Summer workers were beaten. 37 churches were bombed or burned. 30 black homes or businesses were also bombed or burned. 4 civil rights workers were killed. 4 others were critically wounded, and at least 3 blacks were outright murdered. And it wasn't just degenerate hicks and illiterates who carried out these killings. Members of Neshoba County law enforcement and local business owners were part of a 10-man lynch mob, which killed 2 white men and a black man who got a flat tire in the wrong place at the wrong time. It took this level of violence to wake up the rest of America, though, to what was going on in the closed-off South, where the murders, beatings, and civil liberties violations against blacks went largely ignored by the rest of the country. Soon after, the next big step by the federal government has been called the most successful piece of civil rights legislation ever adopted by the U.S. Congress: the Voter Rights Act of 1965. This was when the U.S. government said enough was enough, with states basically pissing on the Constitution. Section 4 ended the use of literacy requirements for voting in 6 southern states: Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, South Carolina, and Virginia, and in many counties of North Carolina, where voter registration or turnout in the 1964 presidential election was less than 50% of the voting age population. Under the terms of Section 5 of the Act, no voting changes were legally enforceable in these jurisdictions until approved either by a 3-judge court in the District of Columbia or by the Attorney General of the United States. Other sections authorize the Attorney General to appoint federal voting examiners who could be sent into covered jurisdictions to ensure that legally qualified persons were free to register for federal, state, and local elections, or to assign federal observers to oversee the conduct of elections. Of course, the southern states righteously fought back against this supposed oppression by the federal government, but they lost. As the Supreme Court put it in its 1966 decision upholding the constitutionality of the Civil Rights Act, quote, Congress had found that case-by-case litigation was inadequate to combat widespread and persistent discrimination in voting because of the inordinate amount of time and energy required to overcome the obstructionist tactics invariably encountered in these lawsuits. After enduring nearly a century of systematic resistance to the 15th Amendment, Congress might well decide to shift the advantage of time and inertia from the perpetrators of the evil to its victims. For those of you out there who think that the federal government exists only to trample your rights and take away your constitutional freedoms, I'd ask that you review your history a little more closely and perhaps look at what laws your states have passed that take away the rights of average citizens based on race, color, gender, or sexual orientation. I think you'll find that your outrage with government should be focused much more on what your state is doing to you than what the federal government is doing to you.